Well, let's talk to Dr. Alan Mendoza about this. He's Executive Director of the Henry Jackson Society. Good morning to you.
Hello, Julia.
Thank you so much for joining us. This is big picture stuff, isn't it? But Amnesty does look into a lot of the details. And I do find it very frustrating when Amnesty International gets involved with some issues which I don't really think are human rights abuses in Western countries like the UK. But when we're looking at people, an invaded nation like Ukraine, dealing with Iran being, run by the mullahs and girls being gassed at school and being taken away and beaten and sometimes killed simply for asking for the right not to have to wear a headscarf, you are in a very different territory. What have they got to say?
Well, I mean, I think that they're quite rightly focused, obviously, on in 2022 being the year of Russia trampling over Ukraine's human rights, the abuses we've seen, which, of course, resulted recently in a war crimes, essentially subpoena by the International Criminal Court on Putin. You can see that there's a focus there, quite rightly a focus on Iran again, the levels of violence used by the Iranian state against protesters who are just protesting for basic things like not having to wear a hijab. This is, kind of extraordinary. And Myanmar, of course, which has somewhat slipped off our news for a while, but again is a highly problematic situation where there are daily human rights abuses. So, on the big picture issues, Amnesty is doing its job. But as I'm sure you're about to come to, it does tend to like having a pop at Western countries and countries who have perfectly functioning judicial systems and free presses to hold people to account. And that's where the beef normally is. It's a question of, there are people who can't help themselves, like in Russia, Iran and Myanmar, and that's who we have to be trying to help the most. And that's really where the focus should be.
Yeah, and again, I don't want bodies like this to only focus on, just the worst abuses, because often those worst abuses are as a result of people letting go the minor abuses. I mean, people not speaking up on these issues. But I do find it extraordinary, some of the criticisms they do have. And Amnesty can get involved on our issues on dealing with, channel migrants, and they speak up on issues like that. Whereas, let's worry about, girls being imprisoned in Iran as rather a bigger issue. But it's interesting, they have condemned, when it comes to Russia and Ukraine, they've condemned abuses by both sides in Ukraine. Now, I've got no doubt at all that, every Ukrainian soldier is not a perfect figure. I mean, no one's pretending that at all. But when they do that, when they criticise both sides, that does give succor to people like Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, of course. I mean, and when they criticise the West, it gives succor to Vladimir Putin, because there may well be, and you're probably right, there probably are human rights abuses in this conflict committed by Ukrainians. But the difference is that the Russians have done this on the state level and have gone out of their way to sort of have a policy, basically, of, if you like, ethnic cleansing or beyond.
And rape as a rape and torture as a weapon of warfare.
As a war crime, which is why they are the ones who are having the war crimes, kind of subpoenas put on them as opposed to the Ukrainians. So, again, I think, Amnesty International, in its bid to, raise awareness of all human rights abuses, doesn't really do justice to the worst malefactors. Because if you start putting people on the same level and start saying, oh, you're hypocrites, etc., well, all you're doing is emboldening the worst human rights abusers in the world to say, you see, even their own human rights organisations tell you they're hypocrites. We will continue doing what we're doing.
I mean, I've always, over the years, admired the work of organisations like this. And it is, people working have had to risk their lives often to get the information and it's very important that we do document this stuff. Although, again, like with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I'm not so interested in there being court cases after the fact. I'd like to prevent the atrocities in the first place. And the best way we do that is getting Russia out of Ukraine. But there is a concern about human rights organisations that they have just sort of this awful phrase, word progressive. I don't think people are progressive. There's a difference between people being protected from, false imprisonment, death, execution, rape, and other human rights abuses. And when they talk about human rights abuses, when people aren't allowed 15 appeals against their deportation when they've entered the country illegally, they often seem to conflate stuff that we would all agree are human rights abuses with sometimes just some sort of technical, paperwork issues as some flagrant abuse of people's human rights, and talking about everybody who's entering another country, for instance, as fleeing death and destruction elsewhere, and perhaps a little bit, let's use the phrase, bleeding harder, rather than perhaps a cold light of day analysis of who really is at risk and who isn't.
Well, exactly. I mean, I think it comes down to this, doesn't it? As I said at the start, there are people in this world who, in a sense, can help themselves because there are functions within the countries they might be coming to or acting within that will help them, i.e., NGOs, judicial systems, free press, who will call this out. If this country, for example, if there are human rights abuses here, you can be sure that will be called out by all number of people, whether it's politicians, media, elsewhere. Yeah. That just can't happen in really oppressive countries. Yeah. And as a result, if you've got limited resources, which all organisations have, no one is saying give a free rein to people to be human rights abusers in the West. Of course not. But when you're looking at the absolute nature of these crimes and the absolute nature of how people can get sort of recompense for them, then you have to say that the point of human rights organisations is to help the most dispossessed people of all. And they're the ones who live in authoritarian, repressive states, who've got no action, no ability to sort of protest beyond, them risking their lives in this way. And that's what they need. They need support there.
I still also find it extraordinary that all these human rights organisations who care so much about civil liberties, absolutely silent throughout 2 years of the pandemic when people's civil liberties were taken away from them, didn't raise a peep of concern at any point whatsoever, because it was okay to take away people's civil liberties then because they agreed with it.
But that's interesting, actually, because that would come down to what I was saying earlier. In the West, we should have had much bigger challenges legally, shouldn't we? We should have been using...
They were thrown out by the courts, so easily.
Well, but that's really interesting, though, isn't it? The fact that, in that sense, civil liberties were let down, if you like, by our own systems. And that's a big surprise, because we pride ourselves, haven't we, on having these robust systems for decades, centuries.
Oh, we have civil liberties until we don't, is what we've discovered. And again, that's what people like me and many others are desperate to make sure we've got these things written in as constitutional rights, so it can't happen again. Dr. Alan Mendoza, I really appreciate you joining us, Executive Director of the Henry Jackson Society. Thank you very much for that.